Welcome to the Agile Strategy Meetup group. My name is Morten Elvang. Today we have Mike Burrows visiting, and it's great because Mike and I had some conversations a while ago about doing a strategy fest, and it's almost like it's happening now by a number of different presentations. And Mike, asking you the same questions as everyone else, meaning what's your take on where strategy is heading, and any
Yep.
useful advice for people who's new to the field. And we follow the normal rules, about 30 minutes for you. And then
Yes.
after that,
Yep.
we open it up for conversation. So
Good.
welcome, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. And yeah, great to join what's been an impressive roster of speakers that Morton's put together. So very glad to be counted among that number. Just going to share my screen. Desktop 2. Here we go. So slightly embarrassed to put a talk with a title with my own name in the title. Meet Mike Burrows on. It says strategy, but I've renamed it Mike Burrows on strategizing already. So already I've cheated. But let's go look at the exam questions. These are the questions that Morton put up. What is your view on strategy and its role and importance in an organization? Any trends or developments? What advice do you have for people on how best to engage on the topic of strategy in their organization? And I'm going to answer both of those both straight away, and we'll recap at the end. Answering straight away, starting at the bottom first of all, start verbing the nouns of business agility, as I call it. And I released a blog post about that recently, and there'll be some links at the end, so don't worry about that now. But you've already seen I've turned strategy into strategizing. It's not enough to have a strategy. You need to be strategizing. You need to be staying in the game when the game may be changing. Now, if you've heard me talk before, you may have heard my story about UBS. I won't tell the whole story again, but it lost $50 billion in the credit crisis. Having a strategy didn't work very well for it when its strategy was to pile into mortgage-backed securities. So, having a strategy just isn't enough. That's not how you build an organization that can sustain itself, build a viable organization, to use the jargon. Let's go back to the first question. Strategizing now that we've verbed that noun as part of a complex and fractal system of constraints with huge adaptive potential. Now that's going to take a bit of explaining, a bit of unpacking, a bit of visualizing. So that's what it talks about. But when you understand that, when you get that, you got the opportunity to engage on the right challenges, invite people to join with you, to celebrate the successes of those who've decided to put their head above the parapet and to innovate in some way. And preceding that, it says everywhere, all at once. Not just focusing on one thing at a time, but enough people in the organization energized, motivated to find things that they can address in the organization, whether it's inside the organization or about the relationship between the organization and the outside world, of course. And we'll talk a bit about outside in versus inside out strategy in a minute or two. So the question, and that's probably quite a scary first slide, is where on earth do you start? So some good bits of folk advice, and actually good advice. Start where you are. Start where you are, use what you have, do what you can, to use the Arthur Ashe version of that. Start with what you do now, which you may remember as Kanban principle number 1. But I'm going to put a complexity twist on it. Start with what you do now, where the you is all the scopes with which each of you identify. You've got a bunch of people in the room. What are the different scopes, perhaps plural, that each of those people identify with? And what's cool about what I'm about to present is that you've got a way of talking about how the experience of the organization is, what its imbalances, what its dysfunctions are, its external relationships, that works even though everyone identifies with different parts of the organization differently. And from a complexity point of view, from a participation point of view, from an engagement point of view, that's really important. Another start with what you do now, or start where you are, is start with what you can be sure of. Now, we're being a bit more philosophical here. Don't start from first principles. First principles can be arbitrary, to put it mildly. Start with the wrong principles and you'll get nonsense. Start with what you can be sure of, what you can actually point to, what you can all agree actually really exists. And even to the start with what you do now principle from Kanban, don't start with your process. Even that you might not agree on, but the fact that there is work happening, that is something you can agree on. So start with things that are really, really basic. And we're starting with really basic things because we're building a model that applies in a huge range of contexts. So the examples I've got here, you've got the band, you've got healthcare, the emergency department, or the operating theatre, you've got a development team. And working in the here and now, so we're not thinking yet about strategy, just working in the here and now, the everyday, just doing our thing. It's the things that come in varying proportions that stay the same. Plan-driven work versus demand-driven work. That applies in all three situations. Solo work versus working with colleagues, the same. Internal versus external interactions. Some of the work that you do is entirely internal. Some of it's going to be making an impact on the outside world, having a conversation with a customer, so on. Routine versus novel or emergent or self-organized. There's some stuff that you do day in, day out, week in, week out, and it always seems to stay the same. There are other things where there are new situations, there's the need for innovation, or you just need to respond to something that's gone wrong, or whatever it might be. You need to do something different. You might create a new technique, a new practice in the process, or you might work with someone that you've never worked before. And that on its own creates new opportunities for the organization. There are also different kinds of work or different drivers to the work, delivery versus discovery versus renewal. And I think this is a big change actually in the 21st century relative to the 20th. If you read the literature on process, so much of it is focused on the production process, not on the integration of delivery and discovery and renewal. And that is one of the big changes that's been brought about by digital. We learn as we deliver, we discover before we build anything, we're forever renewing our capabilities, developing our capabilities and so on. And it's all part of the same thing, all part of the same work, increasingly integrated. So I think that's a new thing, certainly for the 21st century, maybe even for this decade where, digital is just so much a normal part of the way that so many of us work. So with all of that, what must be there? Remember, start with what we can be sure of. What must be there? And we're also going to ask what constrains it. I think we're agreed there must be some work happening. That work, some of that work at least, will have some impact on the environment. That's not much of a model, but if we ask what constrains it, if we at least deal with the fact that if there were no constraints on that work, it would be chaos. You get two different kind of constraints on that work. There's some coordinating constraints, coordinating between people over shared resources, perhaps limited resources, and we minimize unhealthy conditions like, overburdening, starvation, all those kind of classic processy things, what we classically call coordination problems, of course. And there's organizing around commitments, managing towards goals or steering towards goals, promoting things that the desired conditions, things that we want that we don't have yet, that we want to move towards. And really, all our work, certainly when we're working with other people, you need those things around the work. These are basic things. That model I've just described, that works whether you're describing a team, a team of colleagues working together, or even the whole organization. You've got team of teams, divisions, departments, whatever structures you might have inside the organization. In the end, the organization is there to get some work done, to make some impact on the environment. That work needs coordinating, it needs organizing. You organize around your commitments, you achieve what you want to achieve, and so on. Now, a question that's not often asked, are those things in healthy and productive balance? Or are they overwhelming, underwhelming, confusing, or otherwise frustrating each other's best efforts? And here's the shocking thing, you can have best practice in terms of how you actually do the work, the technologies that you use, the programming languages you use, the latest in, functional programming, whatever it might be, in that circle. You might have, a world-class tracking systems to manage all that work. You might have world-class project management, and yet it's just horrible. The three parts can be individually best breed, best practice, whatever, but together they just don't work well. They really do need to support each other. And you know that it's working when you are liberating the communication and decision-making capacities of your organization. So often we talk about improving our organizations as achieving more for less. I think it'd be much healthier if we started understanding improvement as things that liberate the communication and decision-making capacities of the organization. Because without it, you won't get anything novel, emergent, or self-organized. This has been known since when 50s, 60s, 70s, certainly the middle of the last century. This is McCulloch's redundancy of potential command, it's called, the theory. But without that excess of decision making and communication capacity, you won't get anything emergent or innovative. You don't get resilience, all those kind of things. And theory aside, intuitively, it makes sense. If you don't have any spare capacity, you don't notice things. If others around you don't have spare capacity and you don't have communication capacity between you, you're not going to get together to deal with it either. So they're utterly dependent on those capacities, and with them, innovation, resilience, all those other things. Anything that relies on emergence, you need an excess of those things. And we should start seeing organizational improvement, and we should start to see organizational health in terms of the availability of communication and decision-making capacity. So the good news there is that we've got a model that admits a vast adaptive capacity. And it's not just adaptive capacity in terms of the existing team structures that we've got, it's an advanced adaptive capacity in terms of self-organization as well. Someone can notice something interesting that's happening in the environment, a challenge or an opportunity. They can bring other people in, they can coordinate over it, they can organize around it. Before you know it, they've got some shared goals, even some shared identity. You've got a group of people with an identity that didn't exist before. Now, I'm getting slightly ahead of myself with identity, but I just want to stress how such a simple model can really admit emergence, self-organization, innovation, and so on. So you're itching for me to get to strategy, and we will get there. So where do goals come from? Where do progress and intelligence and insights go to? What keeps delivery, discovery, and renewal in appropriate balance? So that first model with the first three boxes just didn't explain any of that. So that first stuff, we were just talking about working in the here and now. What happens when we're stepping back, thinking about things, reflecting back, projecting forward? That's not the here and now, that's something very different. And we're going to explore a new space. So we've got the delivery, discovery, renewal space, now the adaptive strategizing space. So at last, the strategy word for you. And the answers to the first two of those questions, we're just going to add one more box, strategizing. Oh no, you knew this was coming. It was in the title of the talk. Understanding ourselves and environment, creating and managing options. So staying in the game when the game may be changing. This is why strategizing is so important. It's essential to our long-term survival, or even our short-term and medium-term survival. Staying in the game when the game may be changing. Now, just to sit with the words strategizing and strategy for a moment, two main flavors of strategizing that my work mostly focuses on, with a bonus third one. So I'm going to take you to a little reflective exercise. Imagine reaching the right customers, meeting their strategic needs meaning their needs, our strategy, achieving results in the way to which we desire. And we can reflect on that. What's that like? When that's working at its ideal best for us, what's that like? Let's enjoy it. Whose needs would we be meeting? What new stories could they tell? And then what stops that? What gets in the way? If we can imagine how we'd like things to be, well, what stops that? What gets in the way in the here, right now, in the here and now? What are the obstacles, the constraints preventing us from moving in the direction that we would like to move? What stops that? What gets in the way? Why is that important? Explore that a bit more. What kind of maybe? Um, and then what would you like to have happen? Let's turn those obstacles into outcomes. Then what happens? Then what happens? Then what happens? And you've got lots of stuff that you can organize into something that looks very much like a decision framework. Now, we've got a bunch of obstacles we'd like to overcome. We have a bunch of outcomes that we'd like to achieve. By construction, they are coherent with each other. And that means if we use them as focuses for effort, it's likely that that work, even if the work is spread over multiple outcomes or multiple obstacles, there'll be some coherence to it. So that's a good start. That's kind of generative change where you're letting people make the change where they are motivated to act in the way that they feel motivated to act. But you're making sure that there is some coherence to what we're trying to do together, and you make sure there's a governance process of some sort that amplifies that coherence until we work out what it is, what is the direction that we're really going in. Well, there are two strategy approaches implied here: reaching the right customers, meeting their strategic needs outside in, achieving results in the way to which we aspire inside out. And of course, I'm sure you know this in this group, no hierarchy, no dichotomy there. These are mutually supportive. They feed off each other. It's a virtuous circle, the wholehearted pursuit of fit, I call it here. You're developing capabilities, pursuing opportunities. New opportunities demand new capabilities. New capabilities create new opportunities. That's the virtuous circle there. And now it's up to us to make some choices about where we want them to be. It's also up to us to make sure that those different approaches are connected. Kind of the bonus strategy approach is working on being a deliberately adaptive organization. That's my name for this model. Some of you will recognize Stafford Beer's viable system model here as well. They overlap hugely, and in the book that I'm writing, and I'm actually about to publish, I'll explain what the relationship is between those two models, and we can explore that in the questions at the end if anyone is particularly interested. It's not just about feedback loops, which is what everyone tends to focus on. Oh, it's good that people focus on feedback loops, and I've been saying to people for a long time, focus on feedback loops. But it's more than that. You need to focus on healthy and productive relationships. So that idea is at the heart of the deliberately adaptive organization. So anyway, back to the model. We've got strategizing. So we asked before, what must be there? What constrains it? Well, what constrains strategizing? And this is where, for this group, I think this is where it gets important. Constraint one, your strategizing is constrained by your model of the world. Now, you need to have a sufficiently predictive model of how things are internally and externally, how we're organized, what we're capable of, what we're doing, what we think others are doing, what we could be doing, what some of our options are, so on and so on and so on. Very, very basic. We need some kind of model. That's at the basis of, that's a constraint on strategy. You could call it the basis of strategy. Constraints 2, 3, and 4 actually come from below. There are our current capabilities. They clearly constrain strategy. There's no point planning to do things of which we aren't and will never be capable. Too much strategy also is perhaps a bit ignorant of what our actual capacity is. So let's make sure that we have people involved in the conversation who actually understand what we're currently doing, what capacity there is, what ability there is to change our plans, and so on. And a more subtle one, there's our ability to perceive. How we're organized, how we're structured has a massive effect on how you see the outside world and how you see yourself. And this is there's an interesting complexity angle to this as well. How you are organized is a function of the commitments that you have made. over time. There's something path dependent about your ability to perceive. I haven't got an OODA loop slide here, but OODA loop fans here will know exactly what I'm talking about. This is why the orient box in the OODA loop is so prominent in the OODA loop. In that OODA loop, in that orient box in the OODA loop, there's a whole load of really path-dependent things. And it's important that you understand that your perception of the world is limited, it's filtered, it's biased, all those different kind of things, and fail to take that into account, you may go too aggressively into an area that you don't understand well enough. Arguably, that's what happened to UBS when it lost its $50 billion. But yeah, that's another topic. So that's constraints 2, 3, and 4 of 6. The fifth one, this particularly applies when you are less than the whole organization, but it applies even to an extent to the whole organization as well. Scopes we must coordinate, organize, and peer with. And also their capabilities, their capacities, their ability to perceive, the quality of those relationships, and so on, and so on, and so on. Around the organization, there's a whole lot of negotiating going on. And this again makes things complex. You don't understand exactly what they're doing. They're also negotiating with other scopes that you know that you are that are less visible to you. And it takes time for the organization to actually converge on something. And how quickly it does that depends a lot on the mechanisms that it uses as well. If it relies a lot on one-to-one conversations, for example, it's going to be a very slow process. If you get everybody in a room, open space style, for example, then that's going to be a faster process. I mean, this is to say something positive about SAFe. Actually, getting everybody in the room once a quarter, in terms of this constraint, might seem actually a pretty good idea. It might be a very expensive way of achieving what it achieves, but you do need to have teams that understand what they're doing. And when anything novel happens, some new information arrives, some new stress on the organization or some new opportunity, again, these conversations need to happen so that the response is coherent. So that's constraint number 5 and number 6. Oh, no, before I get to number 6, overcommitment is to the strategy process what overburdening is to the delivery process. That's a quote from my forthcoming book. But an overcommitted scope has limited room for negotiation. And if all the scopes around you are limited in what changes they can make, so are you. You can't have an adaptive, agile, flexible organization if all the relationships have lost their flexibility. So this is it's a significant, it's a fundamental constraint. Now, the go-to intervention with a lot of these problems is participation. If you're doing things one-to-one style, and those negotiations are taking too long, well, bring people together. Commitments being made irrespective of capacity or capability, make sure again that capacity, that capability is represented. If you know that you have blind spots in terms of perception, get people there, get them involved, make sure you've got people well positioned to find out what you need to find out and involve them in the conversations. Inflexibility over commitment, make sure you have people who have the power to revoke commitments. So this is one area where sponsorship can be really important, not for their ability to sign the check on new things, but actually to can things that should be canned to make the capacity that you're going to need. So one final question, what keeps delivery, discovery, renewal in appropriate balance? That's something I raised before. The more conventional, more traditional way of the more 1970s way of putting this is, how do we keep strategizing and organizing in appropriate balance? So strategizing reflects all the things we could do and all the effort that goes into thinking, to planning, reflecting, retrospecting, all those different things. And then there's the organizing, which represents all the things that we are currently doing, all the here and now work, the delivery work, all the stuff that has to get done, operational stuff. So how do we find that right balance between the strategic thinking and the operational delivery? How do we find the right balance between delivery, discovery, renewal, and so on? All these really important balances. And these really are important balances. I mean, startups, for example, face this. How much do I invest in the platform? How much do I invest in, serving what few customers I actually have? I worked for a startup that over invested in platform and never actually created a product that they could sell. Now, other people complain of working for organizations that are so focused on delivering to customers that the underlying platform is getting worse and worse and worse in terms of its quality. There's not the investment, the renewal into its platform. So that we need a new system here. I'm going to skip a few slides because we're running slightly out of time. I do want to give you the time. So a new system called self-governing. Self-governing is about our scope, our organizations, our team's sense of identity, its purpose and values, first of all. It's a filter on bad ideas or ideas that are just not us, if you know what I mean. But it has this fundamental job of maintaining that balance between the operational work that we're already committed to and the planning and projecting and what ifs and everything else about what we could be doing. So that's self-governing. And again, a bit like in the that first space, delivery, discovery, renewal, we can think about healthy and productive balance. Or if you want to do this TRIZ-wise, what's the worst that we could do? How could we really screw this up? How could we have an unhealthy relationship between organizing and strategizing? How can we have self-governing, ineffective in its job, or actually overdoing it, representing an image of itself that doesn't actually work relative to other scopes in the organization or with respect to customers and so on. So that has built up a basic model of two spaces: delivery, discovery, renewal, and adaptive strategizing. The relationships between those are absolutely crucial. And we don't have the time for it, but if we had the time, I would take you through 100 years of organizing, and we'd understand why we no longer talk about functional organizations, and even the divisional organization seems quite old hat. And where we get to is that we need delivery, discovery, renewal, and adaptive strategizing to understand each other, and we need them to trust each other, to be trustworthy. We need different scopes in the organization to trust each other, to be trustworthy, and so on. You can't afford the decision-making and communication capacity of mistrust or of untrustworthiness. So you can think of a lot of improvement as being building a more trustworthy organization, but you need to do more than that. You need to know that the right things are brought to the right people's attention when they're going wrong. So things like optimizing communication, distributing authority, those are ways in which we improve our organizations. But we need to build a more trusting and trustworthy organization, and where we're optimizing our attention and presence outside the routine. Now, the first three things can be done with the basic organization design, improving routine processes, and so on. There's no substitute. I'm going to apologize to the AI guys, but there's no substitute for attention and presence outside of the routine. Over-rely on the formal communication lines of your organization, over-rely on the formal process, and sooner or later, something is going to get you. And the fundamental problem is that to make a good decision, whether it's a strategic decision or an operational decision, you need context. And if those communication lines of communication aren't up to the job, you're going to make a bad decision. That bad decision consumes even more of that precious communication and decision-making capacity. People who have studied this, and it was Stafford Beer who did it first in the 1970s, studied this and realized that the formal was never going to be enough. You need the informal, you need managing by working around, you need going to the Gemba, you need escalation, you need stop the line, all these different techniques that we talk about are ways to optimize the limited communication and decision-making capacity we have, to optimize the limited attention that we have. So that creates the need for a third space and another system, mutual trust building, we call it. And again, with time, I could talk about some of the ways that we can optimize, maximize presence, communication capacity, decision-making capacity, and so on, and then at the level of the individual leader. So just to summarize, that's my three-space model: delivering, discovering, renewal, adaptive strategizing, mutual trust building. It looks quite different to the viable system model in the way that that is classically presented. It does make certain things very much easier. First of all, it makes talking about it a lot easier. The diagrams are a lot less complicated, but also exposes the relationships between levels of scale of organization in a way that is much more difficult with the classic one. I won't go into these pictures now, but if you want to deal with problems of scale, understand them. And the risk is if you don't and you try to scale something, you just make it bigger and more complicated. Now just look at what's happened to agile process over the last 20 years, and I think that is actually what happened. That is what's happened. We scaled process without understanding how organizations work, and as a result, made it bigger and more complicated. That's the basic model. The whole point is to have people having conversations about it, identifying what constraints they would like to change. We've got a bit of Dave Snowden here, his affordance mapping, creating ideas, conducting experiments on the organization, and so on. But with this model, this framework, this way of understanding the organization, this way of making sense of our experience, our different experiences of the organization in a way that brings the shared constraints on the organization to the surface so that we can do something about them. So that's me. Meet Mike Burrows on strategizing, not strategy. Hopefully the bits I wrote in yellow make a bit more sense now. Now I have put a page up at agendashift.com/keynotes with links to some of the blog posts that I've been sort of channeling while I've been speaking, so you may find that helpful. Also, in the very near future, I'm going to release, this was a decision made only this week, but I'm going to be releasing a version of the new book on Lean-Pub before I go to go to Amazon and everywhere else. So watch this space, and I think literally by the end of the week, next week or the week after next, hopefully you will see wholehearted engaging with complexity in the deliberately adaptive organization out on Lean-Pub. If you subscribe to my mailing list, then you will certainly get to hear about it, or if you follow me on LinkedIn. So it's a radically new presentation of the viable system model, but actually surprisingly faithful to it. I'm very respectful of the original source material, but it does need a bit of reinterpretation for the 21st century, both for reasons of complexity and because digital organizations work quite differently to the way the manufacturing organizations did that were the bread and butter of the the management cybernetics community, operational research communities, and so on back in the last century. So putting my head above the parapet a bit there, I'm working at the intersection of systems and complexity, which is sometimes a painful place to be. You get tomatoes thrown at you from both sides. But I think the book makes a contribution, and I encourage you obviously to read it as soon as it's out. So that's the talk bit done. I spoke quite quickly and I skipped a few slides, but I just about managed that in about half an hour. I will stop sharing my screen, and I will let I guess Morten, you're the compere for for this last half an hour.
Thank you, Mike.
So, by the way, I always say don't be afraid to ask me the hard questions. I mean, the hard questions are much more interesting. The softball questions I can bat away. Ask me a hard question, and I might go off on one for a bit, and that'll be
So I
fun.
have a really hard one to start with.
Oh yeah.
Your slides. Tom shared a link in the notes to your Dropbox. I presume that's the right version, so we can distribute that.
Yes. Yes. So if you go to agendashift.com/keynotes, you'll see, in fact, it's keynote/strategizing, even
Okay,
with
very
strategizing
well.
with the.
Yes, so I'll just assume
Um,
that it's the correct one and share that with everyone.
yes. So the link that's on that page is accurate. But there's some other resources there as well. So let me
Very
put
well.
the link. Yeah. Yeah. Good.
Then
And
Tom,
I'll
Tom had some.
yeah,
Go
go
ahead.
for it.
Oh, I'm sorry, there's some latency, so please. Tom had some questions.
Yeah.
Q1 there in the notes. So I'm just reading it. How do you articulate the long-term objectives for strategies?
So it's in really everything I've been doing for the last 10 years now, so since about 2015, I've been very focused on, I didn't even know the name existed 10 years ago, but what's called variously known as dialogic organization development, and maybe a subgenre of dialogic organization development called generative organization development. And it's very much a conversational process, or at the heart of it, at least, excuse me, is a conversational process, and there were hints of it in the presentation. So there'll be some work to establish some context. In terms of where are we? What are we dealing with? Um, we might want to narrow the conversation down to a particular organizational scope. There's a particular situation that has prompted us to meet. So it's establishing context, and then it's ideal obstacles outcomes. So ideal when that's well, we focus on something that captures something either of the challenge that we face or the opportunity that's in front of us, or it's going to energize the conversation and we explore that with the ideal questions. When that's working at its ideal best for us, what's that like? Whose needs would we be meeting? What new stories could we tell? All the rest of it. From the slides, what stops that? What gets in the way? And those are really important questions because we're getting to what's really there, what's really happening, grounding the whole thing in reality. Then it's what would you like to have happen? Then what happens? Then what happens? Now I'm simplifying because you would get bored very quickly asking just those questions. But logically, at
Okay,
least,
so
what
so
would you like
the
to have
answer
happen?
to
Then
the
what happens?
long term.
So we once you're talking in terms of outcomes, and you ask then what happens? Then what happens? That takes you to the increasingly long term.
Okay,
Um, And it can also take you even to the point of things that are kind of beyond long term. They're more sort of stable things like values and purpose and so on. Um, and you can organize them in different ways. You can organize them visually, you can organize them with OKRs, you can quantify some of them, and so on and so on. I know Tom, you would like to quantify them. Quite often, we use outcomes as a way to create OKRs. And I always say I'm cautiously optimistic on OKR. There are some terrible things you can do with OKR. But OKR as an efficient summary of a strategy conversation that has actually happened, I think actually it's quite efficient. And again, it can be helpful to quantify things as well. How do we
okay,
know that we're winning? How do we know that we've won? And perhaps go a bit beyond that. OKR people talk about stretching. What do we dare to hope for? What do we aspire to? And so on. Yeah, and people forget this is 40 years old, this stuff. 1983 is when Andy Grove wrote High Output Management. He described OKR there without using the acronym, but it's been around a very long time. But a kissing cousin to management by objectives, which I think most of us know is a recipe for disaster. And it's important to understand why. So short answer to Tom's original question, then what happens, then what happens, then what happens, takes you to increasingly longer outcomes. Um, so I am simplifying greatly, but that's the gist. And
okay,
sometimes we talk less in terms of outcomes and more in terms of constraints, and there's a lot more of that in the new book.
okay.
But that's how we do it. Yeah.
Tom has to be the judge of that. There's a question number two in the absence of raised hands. Using your method with your clients, what are the major improvements over any other named strategizing method? You mentioned SAFe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I would describe SAFe as a strategizing method. But anyway, I tend to get involved in two kinds of situations, and they're kind of at extremes. And I'm not sure either very well represents the question. But there's obviously it's quite over the years I've done a lot around at the level of teams and especially a team of teams. I like to get at least three levels of organization together. I think that's when conversations start to get interesting. So team of teams where you've got some team members, team leads, a management team, maybe some customer representation in there as well. That can make things more interesting as well. Um, it's hard to make the comparison because I don't know what else they would have done. And of course, we don't have we don't have a parallel universe to compare with where they tried that other thing. Um, but what's the feedback I get? People are energized by the conversation. People actually do talk to each other, which is important. It's amazing how people sometimes manage to avoid that. Um, and you come away with things that you've all agreed on. People feel motivated to act on, and so on. And by those measures, it's successful. At the other extreme, I've done some whole company stuff. And what's interesting there is that the times they get brought in, there's usually some kind of crisis happening. And I think they are desperate for a fresh pair of eyes. Perhaps they were hoping I would just tell them the answers, but that's just not my style,
Mm.
And they've got to understand their situation themselves. In one of those instances, I didn't even realise the face the crisis until I got there, until I was actually already facilitating a workshop. Um, I'm not going to tell you the whole story because it's too embarrassing to them. But there were things about the workshop that were very, very weird, and some of the answers didn't actually make sense. The kind of responses coming back from the different table groups, just there was just no comparing them. They were on different planets. Um, and that's when I first, understood what existential crisis means. They didn't know why they existed. They were fortunate they had a cash cow product that they could rely on, but they didn't know how long they could rely on it for.
Okay. Yeah.
And so their challenge was what happens next, and they had no idea, at least not to start with. Um, the feedback I got afterwards was this was a disaster, and then 2 weeks later, I started getting the feedback. Well, actually, we like some of those handouts that you gave, and we're actually making some progress here. So they it was a shock to too many people, the state they were in, but then they
Mm.
realised actually there were things that they could do. So in the end, the
Yeah.
outcome was positive.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Any questions, comments?
If I may,
Yep.
thank you, Mike, for the presentation. I appreciate it. Um, I also like the fact that you brought in estuarine mapping.
Oh, cool. Yes,
I've
yes,
I've played with that for a while, and the focus on constraints. I
yes.
appreciate that too.
So just for the record and for everybody else, so estuarine mapping is the Dave Snowden's overall. I'm going to say framework, but it gets really the terminology gets really confusing. But estuarine mapping is its overall process for understanding an organization, finding its affordances and constraints, doing experiments, and so on. So it's quite analogous to what I've been doing for the last 10 years as well. But it begins with this metaphor of the estuary, an estuary with different kinds of boundaries, hard and soft, energy flowing, water flowing in and out, different energies, different rhythms, man-made aspects, natural aspects, all the rest of it. It's quite a rich metaphor that he uses. Um, it's a metaphor that doesn't actually work for me that well, but that's just me. Maybe I'm just one of those people that has an allergic reaction to metaphors. But there's a visual tool. I won't call it a mapping tool because he calls the whole thing mapping. But there's a visual tool called Estuarine Framework that works in a similar way to the Cynefin framework in that you draw the boundaries after you've placed all the things on the board, and that's
Mm.
really really important. Um, and he was gracious enough to allow for it to be referred to by another name, affordance mapping, which doesn't have the word estuarine in it. Um, he's not like delighted that other people are doing random things with his stuff, but he's been gracious enough to allow us to do it. And how we use that exercise is described in the last chapter of the new book when it comes out. So we're organizing constraints or affordances. Affordances are things that you can actually interact with that will, change some of the constraints of your organization. So yeah, it is a very cool thing. Full credit to Dave for it. Yeah.
But that wasn't my question, but thank you. My question was more about building trust
Yes. Oh,
and
yes.
a trustworthy organization.
Yes.
And we were just referring to an example where there was no coherence in
Yes.
the group.
Yes.
Uh,
Right.
how would you start building trust within a group like that?
Yes. My advice to teams is usually, you build trust by delivering. Um, and how do teams that aren't delivering actually deliver? Is, well, they stop doing all the things that are stopping them from delivering. I mean, those sound like really glib, trite answers, but actually they really aren't. And actually focusing on what they can deliver, focusing on the one thing they could deliver next that would build some trust, and focusing on it is a good place to start. And actually, that's a very lean principle. You start from the customer end and work backwards. I mean, one of my books is called Right to Left, and this is, in a way, all about that. Starting from the customer end and working backwards. When we review our work every day, start with the work that's closest to completion, or the stuff that is completed and we're still learning from. Then the stuff that's closest to completion, and so on. And when you start to practice that, then you're much less inclined to push work into a system that's already at capacity or over capacity.
Well, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Often the problems are upstream
Yes.
and not at the end.
No. Well,
Not going into estrians again, but
yes. I mean, but I don't want to turn this into talk about process, but that delivering is one way in which you
yeah.
build trust. Now, another way is, if you're talking about conversations, dialogue, and all the rest of it, we put quite a lot of. I've talked about obstacles. What stops that? What gets in the way? You get obstacles, and it's very easy for people to come up with obstacles that are blaming people, judging people, selling solutions, selling theories, or various other ways that you can frame obstacles in ways that doesn't actually help you have a productive conversation. And a little bit of effort put into framing those obstacles in a better way goes a long way. And what's great about this exercise is one of those exercises that rubs off onto the everyday. Now, in the context of the workshop, we reframe obstacles so that we get better answers when we ask, what would you like to have happen? Or when we play 15-minute photo or whatever we're going to do. But people are also really struck by how judgmental, how selling, how you might have an obstacle, obstacles that don't get to the issues. Is what I'm thinking of. When we say our obstacle is our culture, our obstacle is mindset. Well, where do you even begin with an obstacle like that? Our obstacle is lack of the agile mindset, or something like that. Got various techniques for framing obstacles in ways that are more conducive to a productive conversation.
Some of the things that you wrote in your first book, Agendashift, yes?
Yes, that's right. So the and I so my fourth book, Organizing Conversations, was that was a commission by the Bush-Marshak Institute. So they are the leading lights in the dialogic organization development community. They commissioned Organizing Conversations. That's only 100 pages long. So if you want the quick version, and in some ways the better version actually, that's the one to go for. There's some online stuff as well. If you go to the resources area, I'll put a link. There's a video called it's called Obstacles Fast and Slow, it's called now. The exercise, it used to be called Good Obstacle, Bad Obstacle. It's now Obstacles Fast and Slow. I'll put the link into chat. But you
Cheers,
see what's
Mike.
happening with that reframing exercise? I mean, you're actually having a conversation potentially about some difficult things, about how we can word it better in a way that actually works for everyone. That's the sort of trust building at multiple levels. Yeah.
That's like Dave would say, bringing it down to a level of where everyone can understand and begin with.
Yes, exactly. Yes, scoping it down and stuff. Yes, yeah.
Sorry to take
We
all
have
your
some.
time.
Oh, thanks, Greg. We have some more questions, and I would prefer if you would ask them yourself. John, would you be willing to do that?
Okay. I can see.
Yeah,
Just,
sorry, that was me. I was
Yep.
dropping a couple of questions that I've been developing in my notepad here. I will put them in the chat for the record, just so they're there. But I'm happy to ask just one of them or any of them, whichever one you like
Go for
best.
it.
go
I'm
ahead. You can
struggling
pick.
to actually read the chat myself, so go for it.
I'll just pitch the first one.
Yeah.
So I work in a big corporate enterprise.
Yep.
Just for context. So I often see that strategy is viewed as a sort of elitist
Yes.
activity where
Yes.
it's only C-level who gets the luxury to go on a
Yes.
street and do strategizing. And that means nobody else thinks it's also their job, right? So
Yes.
how can we create a sense of agency to do strategizing at all levels?
Yes. That's actually a really excellent question. I mean, everything I've described as a fractal thing. I didn't maybe I haven't used that word, but
Yeah.
team of teams, whole organization, and so on. And there is strategizing at every level. And in fact, your team, without perhaps realizing it, the slides I skipped over are describing what I call everyday strategizing.
Mhm.
You're always problem solving, you're always coming up with new ideas, always looking for ways forward, and so on. And what's interesting is that some of that innovation, some of that energy is directed at actually maintaining that team, that scope itself. A catchphrase of mine: the team that strategizes together stays together. It just won't survive for very long without it. It is happening everywhere. The question is whether what's happening at team level, team of levels, department level, division level, executive board, whether those are coherent with each other. And that's where these vertical lines in that picture, one of the pictures I kind of skipped over goes on. Do the structures make sense? Do the way we structure ourselves, understand the organization, structure our work, do those actually work together? And so often they don't. And that leads to blind spots and overinvestment and other expensive things. Are we adequately translating progress, issues, and performance from one level of scale to the next, from team to team of teams, and so on up? Obviously, teams talk a different language to the board, but somehow we're the same organization. How does that work? That's what that translation is about. How does that reconciliation work? I touched on it in the talk. How do peer teams? How do teams versus higher levels and so on? How do we make sure that when we're planning something, or when we are reacting to something, that our response is going to be coherent? And something fascinating there is that if we're doing this too much, if there's too much escalating going on, rather than see that as a problem with the origin of that escalation, a dodgy process. Perhaps the fact that we need to be escalating all the time is because we're not distributing authority well enough. Perhaps it's a structural problem, or it's a problem with our attitude to leadership, or something else. And it's those repeated signals should be a sign that we should be changing. If you're getting the same signal all the time and you're ignoring it, or you're not doing anything to address it, then that indicates a problem with learning. There's talked about context as well, making sure that people have the context they need to make good decisions, whether that's a delivery decision or a strategy decision. So one way to if you're working at team level and the organization is 5 levels deep, you're not going to solve the exec board, the issue of strategy coming down from the top straight away. But you can invest in the relationships sideways and upwards. You've always got the opportunity to do that. And so what I'm giving you with the model or with the book is different things to look for, different things that literally must be happening in your organization, because if they weren't, your organization would fall apart. But look at whether they are working well enough, whether the relationships are appropriately balanced, whether you're overwhelming, underwhelming each other. There's various sort of dimensions of quantity, time, structure, information, and so on that you can look at as well in terms of how you overwhelm and underwhelm people. This all sounds quite abstract because I've only got time to present the structure of the model, but if you go through the book, then it's all just examples that will be very, very familiar to you. Yeah.
We have one more
Thank you.
question. John, please go ahead.
Can I?
Absolutely.
Yes, cool. Thank you very much. So, regarding the points of building trust, removing communication silos, and allocating time for discovery and renewal,
Yes.
company size,
Yes.
number of people,
Yeah.
had last again.
Keep going.
Oh, sorry. What company size, number of people had lastly successfully managed to implement an adaptive strategy? So the amount of people to know the size of the organization, and after what amount of time were what exact 1-2 first results felt by the company in terms of people and management?
Yeah. So think back to my first book, Kanban from the Inside. My case study there was a company of about 50 people, so not a large, not large. I had made substantial changes within the first week. Going back to that trust thing, I had a small team that was under delivering because it was trying to do 5 projects when it should be doing 1. And in fact, when I looked at the organization as a whole, there were more initiatives in flight than there were people in the organization. I mean, it's ludicrous. So I was there as the CTO, and I worked first in my area, but some of what I was doing that rubbed off on other parts of the organization, and that issue of there being more initiatives than people, the managing director actually in the end he owned that, and he literally physically dropped our meeting minutes into the bin, saying we're starting from a blank sheet of paper. So that took initial improvements a week. It took months to get to that point, but that's actually pretty not a bad time frame for an organization of 50 odd people, and that had a happy ending. That one, it ended up in a reverse takeover of a large organization. So that was the goal that we were aiming for. At a very different scale, and I'm not going to take responsibility for it, credit for it, because I actually left UBS in the credit crisis. I mentioned $50 billion loss. It very nearly killed the company. But last year or the year before, UBS took over Credit Suisse. To have gone from being an absolute disaster to taking over their leading competitor in their home country. And it's funny, I start my book and I start some of my talks with 2 very different stories, a happy story and a sad story, but it's actually the sad story that ultimately is the better illustration of viability. Because there is the drive and the wherewithal to survive and thrive in a changing and hostile environment, to improve its capacity for independent existence, if you like that definition, to improve its capacity for independent action, which is the more John Boyd definition, which I prefer. So that took a period, in that case, that took how long? 2008 or so to 2023 or 2024. We're talking about 15 years or so. So that took a long time. I've worked at intermediate scales. I've worked in government digital. Not always at the strategy level, and I worked as delivery manager on 2 of the UK government digital services. But that idea of being very connected to the customer, measuring progress in terms of the customer making progress, that's something we're very, very committed to. And a very high trust organization really from the very beginning. I think people are surprised that working in government can be such an amazing experience, but in those days it really was. I'm not sure how well that answers your question. I've worked in quite a range of organisations, and not specifically on the trust thing, but you don't have to build trust by delivering. That's message number 1, and also to build trust, you have to start where you are. You start with your relationships, sideways, up and down, and there are certain things that you can look for and amplify. Yeah.
Mike, time is up, but not more up than
Okay.
that. So thanks so much for joining us. Anything we can do for you, or any final word?
Well, so go to that link with the keynotes link with the resources for the book, and if you come back in say 2 weeks, hopefully the book will be available by then on LeanPub. Maybe Morten can put up a note to people when that's out, but we'll see. Yeah.
Very well.
And thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for the questions.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your ideas. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
I can definitely share. I think you can even do that yourself. It's a public group, so you just put it out there.
Great. Good.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.